Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to all the organizers and my panelists, my co-panelists. I'm really thrilled to be here today. What I'm presenting on is my dissertation topic, which deals everything to do with chronodissidence in the Americas. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here with such an amazing group of scholars and organizers and participants. Okay. How do contemporary Caribbean artists address history and memory in their practices? How, in their artworks, does diaspora make itself known visually and thematically? Are there traceable ways in which contemporary Caribbean diasporic artists address belonging to more than one place in space-time simultaneously? These are the main questions of today's presentation and of my overall dissertation project. Before we begin, I'd like to situate us a little bit in a quote by Stuart Hall, who's a really essential Caribbean theorist, scholar, and formative thinker. But what this detour through its past does is to enable us, through culture, to produce ourselves anew, as new kinds of subjects. It is therefore not a question of what our traditions make of us so much as what we make of our own traditions. Paradoxically, our cultural identities in any finished form lie ahead of us. We are always in the process of cultural formation. Culture is not a matter of ontology, of being, but of becoming. So as I named my first few questions at the beginning, in attempting to address these questions, this project, which is entitled When I Am Not Here, Estoy Allá, Visualizing Expansive Space-Time in Caribbean Diasporic Memory, articulates a thread of memory keeping particular to contemporary Caribbean diasporic artworks. Neither distinctly chronological nor explicitly thematic, this project focuses instead on a system of improvisational relationships. So this poetic universe, which is a borrowed term, this poetic universe constructed here draws out a world of multivalent space and time, performed and weaved together through the works and the productions of 5 contemporary Caribbean diasporic artists, all of whom are here. Deeply entrenched in ontological systems specific to diasporic belonging, which is not unbelonging, but rather both belonging, the sensorial plane imagined here supersedes the bounds of both linear narrative and colonial memory. And I want to take a second here to pause because that particular understanding of diasporic belonging, which is not unbelonging in any place, but rather both belonging in simultaneous places, is the linchpin of both this project and my dissertation as a whole. So, operating within a distinctly Caribbean, specifically Black Atlantic lineage of cultural production, the 5 artists featured in this poetic universe, again, all here, provide a substantial and generative basis for the study of global Caribbean diaspora currents. The artists who form and inform the bedrock of this project are Maria Magdalena Campos Pons in the top left, born in Cuba, but living and working now out of Nashville, Tennessee. Lavon Bell, who's in the bottom center, born in Trinidad and Tobago, but based out of St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands. Freely Baez, who's in the top right, who's born in the DR, but lives and works mostly out of New York now. Deborah Jack, who's in the bottom right, who's born in the Netherlands, but lives and works between St. Martin and, I think she's at Rutgers right now in New Jersey, but also New York. And then Alberta Whittle, who's in the bottom left, who was born in Barbados, but lives and works out of Glasgow now. So hopefully you're starting to see a bit this sort of circum-Caribbean that I'm talking about. All artists who are born from the Caribbean proper is generally understood, but who live and work in a wide circuit now. Collectively and individually, the practice of these artists are polylingual, performative, and frequently transdisciplinary. Theirs is a Caribbean cosmology fueled by refusal. Refusal to be tied down, to be named in full, to be made into something stable and static. Adhering neither to the confines of nation state nor artistic style, the works of Campos Pons, Bell, Baez, Jack, and Whittle speak to a larger diasporic practice, one in which an increasingly expansive Caribbean, taking a note out of Saidiya Hartman's conceptualization of critical fabulation, continuously reimagines and remaps itself out in this sort of growing circuit. Well, I had a little too early, but unbounded by the demarcations of land, medium, or time itself, these artworks and the artists whose practice they originate from enact, quote, a dialogue between abstraction and representation, and in doing so, offer the possibility of a more transgressive Caribbean future, one rooted in continuous becoming. So as we'll see throughout this presentation, my work is situated in art history, in digital humanities, and in curatorial practice. So we'll follow a little bit of the format of each chapter of my dissertation, in which is each a room in the ongoing exhibition, which lives digitally right now. So the first section of this exhibition, or this dissertation project, is entitled, When I'm Not Here, Estoy Allá, at the Shoreline. This room centers questions of land, geography, memory, and belonging. Here we see a work by LaVon Bell from 2020. It's part of a series of works called For Those Who Live at the Shoreline, which takes its title from an Audre Lorde poem, A Litany for Survival. So all of the artists, and hopefully those will come through throughout the presentation, are deeply embedded in research practice and are all involved in and out of academia as well, so I'll frequently embed references that come up in their own works. In this room, landscapes dominate, intertangled and inseparable with the bodies that are born from them. Localized topographies become self-aware caricatures. Humanoid figures become flora and fauna. Folklore becomes history, and myth becomes fact. Right here, I'll take a quick second to pause on two stills from a recent Deborah Jack work that was part of a survey show called, oh gosh, it's escaping me right now, A Forecast Form, Caribbean Art in the Caribbean Diaspora, 1990s to today. These were taken, I think, at the MCA Chicago, its origination point, but I saw it in Boston. It's traveling too. The affordances of film is something that comes up frequently throughout this project as an art form or art medium that allows for multiple panels, multiple channels, multiple sort of realities or temporalities happening simultaneously. And this particular work was a multi-channel video that interweaved archival footage of salt mines in the Caribbean, also more contemporary footage, so this looping and this interweaving of different temporalities, different sort of streams of information. The second section of this project, entitled To Breathe Full and Free, A Space for Grief and Care, centers abstraction as a space of reprieve. Reprieve from the demands of representation, from the ever-consumptive gaze, from the constant performance of being perceived and articulated as other. Here we have a Campos Pons piece, part of a series, as many of her works are, entitled Because the Human Body is a Tree, Spring Awakening One. It's part of a triptych, so there are two others as well. In this room, abstraction itself becomes stretched from a purely formal space to include the abstraction of self into collective. Individuals become absolved into time and material, and allowances are made for what grows in the space of release. Here are a couple of photos that were taken in December of this year. This was at a Campos Pons exhibit that was here in New York at the Brooklyn Museum called Behold. It was the first major retrospective of her work in, I think, 20 years or so in the US, maybe longer. It was really incredible. I bring these in here because, though I don't have them up next to what was next to them in the exhibit, right next to these, if anyone was at it, were a series of really didactic artworks that were portraiture of enslaved folks, some of her really famous early slave ship imagery, so really sort of visceral and in many ways violent works. And I write on this more in my dissertation, but I believe that very much so that representation is used as a reprieve after that, or protective sort of space. So thinking through in this particular room, how abstraction offers that space of release, offers that space of moving away from having to always be the focus of the gaze, of this sort of artistic or historical gaze. The final section of this project, entitled How to Imagine the Tropical as Counter-Monumental, centers ephemerality and temporality. In this room, Campos Pons, Bell, Baez, Jack, and Whittle are caught in the constant act of performing remembrance, performing identity, performing citizenship and participation in the state. And here we have a still from Alberta Whittle's Lagara, The Last Born. This was taken at the National Galleries of Scotland, though this particular piece was first created for the Venice Biennale a couple of years ago. I believe, hopefully I don't have that wrong. Pushing against the bounds of colonial legacy, the tensions inherent to the works in this final section illuminate the tenuous threads by which all constructs of security ultimately hang. Here in the bottom right, I want to draw our attention to the Maria Magdalena Campos Pons piece. These are not the exact works that were situated next to the abstract works that we looked at a few slides ago, but these are very similar to the kind of imagery that was included in those works. The two on the top, I think your top left and bottom left, are both stills from a LaVon Bell piece that just closed. It was in Philadelphia, where she traced her body throughout the island for the course of a day and took photographs of herself as she moved through the island, as the sun did too. And the top right pieces is still from a Campos Pons film and performance that took place at the National Gallery of Art. So in all of this particular room, built installation, ephemerality, and film all sort of interweave together to think through the counter logic of monumentality and how that's employed by Caribbean and Caribbean diasporic artists. Here's another, this is a series of stills from a Deborah Jack work. I won't spend too long on this one, but I'll note the central figure who appears, these are all film stills, the central figure who appears in this white dress. The film traces her as she moves from an inland portion of the island to the shore, and frequently throughout Jack's work, this sort of apparition-like figure appears, and similarly in some of the Levon Bell pieces that we've already seen, the reoccurrence of the sort of ghost-like figure is really prominent, and I write through it as a way to think through, usually the adage is said that that which lives also dies, but the counter logic applies throughout this project, which is that that which dies also lives. And these figures which reappear, these apparition-like figures, are not just ancestor and they're not just present, they're sort of the living haunting. I'll spend a quick second here. This is a Levon Bell piece. This particular piece is called I Am Queen Mary. If you haven't heard anything about it, I would encourage you to look it up. It was first created in 2018 on the 100-year anniversary of the sale of what were the Danish Indies to the US. They're now St. Croix, the US Virgin Islands. So on the 100-year anniversary, Bell works back and forth between the Caribbean and the sort of Danish metropole right now, thinking through how colonial memory frequently works one way, but amnesia works the other way. So she writes frequently in her own work and talks frequently about how the memory of Danish colonization is very prominent in the Caribbean, but memory of colonization of the Caribbean is not prominent in Denmark. And this particular monument, which in 2020 got the go-ahead to become permanently installed, is the first monument to a Black woman in the country. It's a really, really incredible piece. And I Am Queen Mary is in reference to a historical uprising that happened in the Caribbean as well. A few last ones. This room is really, really built out. A few more stills. The two on the right are both Frile Baez pieces, which the first install was at the ICA waterfront of this, but this is a recreation of the Palace of Sans Souci, which was the Haitian palace following the Haitian Revolution. She very much so talks and thinks through how the recreation of this piece in Boston, which was another hotbed of revolution, is thinking through her placement as both an artist who's from Haiti and the DR, but has ties to Haiti and the DR, but is also living and working out of the Northeast too, so really fomenting this fact that she exists simultaneously in all places and times. The three on the right are all Alberta Whittle pieces, but again, thinking through monumentality, ephemerality, and the construction and deconstruction of monumental spaces. Lastly, I want to talk, or not lastly, but I want to move on a little bit to talk about how the digital platform that's hosting this exhibition as I'm working on it, and also some of my methodology behind naming all of the rooms that I've just named, and I use the term room in quotations, to alleviate the pressure of describing a space, such as a digital exhibition, which has no particular physical bearing, but has to be moved through all the same. So really thinking through how we talk about moving through spaces that we're actually not moving through in the way that we usually think of moving through. And as an intentional practice in centering the artist's innate understandings, and in order to let their work speak for themselves as much as possible, the names for each of these rooms are drawn from the titles of works included in it. So they're pastiched and collaged together. So I've taken the titles from all of their works, pastiched and collaged them together into the titles of the names of the rooms themselves. And often they pop up in unexpected places. For instance, the name of the work isn't always the name of the room that it's in. This is another way for me to think through, I think, something that they're thinking through too, which is this multivalent sort of space-time and displaced knowledge that's embedded in many ways. And I've done this also to allude to the vibrant lineage of poetic and idiomatic language present throughout the Caribbean and its diasporas. I've done my best to honor their robust way of seeing, knowing, and naming, and very much so want to honor that. So this exhibition, as I'm building it and as it lives currently, is being hosted on ArcGIS. I don't know if anyone has used ArcGIS or Story Maps, but I've opted into it intentionally. So I'm very interested in the opportunities afforded by digital networks, as I think a lot of us are, such as long-distance viewing, generative collaboration, critical engagement, open access hosting, so less of a barrier to get to it. You don't have to travel, you're frequently not a cost. But I do, and as many of us are, want to remain cautiously wary of recreating historically skewed power and viewing structures. So I've got some pros and cons here, but some of the biggest cons to remember, and I'm frequently reminded by my peers and colleagues, is open access for who. So who has access to these knowledges? I'll get to a little bit more about that later when I conclude with my next steps for the project. This project leans into a vibrant, ongoing dialogues within the fields of Black digital humanities, Black digital practice, and Caribbean cultural studies. So ArcGIS, and usually I have a little QR code up here. I don't seem to have included on here, so afterwards, if anyone's interested, I can share the QR code with you. It's still being developed, but I'm very much so interested in it being an in-process thing, so welcome people viewing it as I build it. But ArcGIS is very, very dynamic and includes a lot of sort of movable capacities that most static digital platforms wouldn't allow for. So you can see here just a couple of snippets from what it looks like as it's developing. Here are a couple of the wall didactics. So you move through the rooms, the wall didactics appear. Up on the top right, you see a little bit of a glyph or a graph of a sort of built poem using some of the titles. So that's another aspect of the digital exhibition, is didactics that weave together and build poetry out of the already poetic language that the artists are employing. So this project is really firmly situated within a wider discourse of Caribbean studies, which is a discourse that holds as truth the tenets of multiplicity, synchronicity, plurality, and polyrhythm. Born in many ways from Antonio Benitez Rojo's conceptualization of the Caribbean cultural machine, this comes from the repeating island right here, the Caribbean cultural machine as a Caribbean rhythm, which is in fact a meta-rhythm, a harmonious dissonance which can be arrived at through any system of signs, whether it be dance, music, language, text, or body language. This project operates under the fallible assumption, I could be wrong, but operates under the assumption that such particularly Caribbean patterns of self-organization pair intuitively not only with the artistic oeuvres of all the artists that I've mentioned here, but also with the disruptions and affordances of digital humanities as a whole. And again, just to reiterate, all of these artists' practice are really generously laden with signs and signifiers of all types. So we'll see here really quickly, actually I'll go back for this. Additionally, the embodied concept of vaiven or vaivenes, which comes from translating blackness right here, the book on the far right. The embodied concept of vaiven, of continuous coming and going, acts as a common thread throughout the artworks and art practices gathered here. Alongside the pulse of the circuitous tide, these comings and goings, Campos Pons, Bell, Baez, Jack, and Whittle weave threads of fluidity, monumentality, ephemerality, and the presence of the body. In Translating Blackness, which is the book on the far right, author Lorgia Garcia Peña identifies vaivenes, or comings and goings, as a site for, quote, critical engagement and a political articulation of the intersections of race, colonialism, and immigration in the 21st century, end quote. Extending Garcia Peña's conceptualization, this project seeks to center a vaiven, coming and going, or as I mentioned, that both belonging, that diasporic both belonging, as a site for critical engagement and cultural articulation at the intersections of racialization, decolonial practice, visual imagery, and Caribbean diasporic imagining. Finally, on our sort of theoretical background, seeking to center what Sonia Donaldson names as strategies of remembrance, and Kim Gallen identifies as technologies of recovery, this project finds hope in ArcGIS's possibilities for creative engagement of the digital, most notably, as I said earlier, in its allowances for open audience access and thoughtful artist artwork contextualization across vast space and time. So you'll see just a little bit here, but this idea of the Caribbean as a super-temporal geography, so a continuously expanding space, I'm beginning to map out through ArcGIS, and you just see a few snippets here where I'm mapping out, and ArcGIS has a function called story maps, so essentially you can build out maps with GIS points, but build in sort of narrative information. I'm using it a way that I don't know that anyone has before, which is I'm mapping out not just artists and their different shows and their practices and where they live and work, but also different figures that frequently appear in their work, sites that they imagine appear, so sort of a layered mapping of the geographies they're building out for themselves throughout their artworks. The Seguapa, who you see here on the far right, is a Dominican folklore figure who frequently appears in Baez's work, but you'll see also Wimap Sansuchi. There's lots of different sort of mythological and real spaces that show up in these layered mappings. On this note, the Caribbean as a supratemporal geography, in the Caribbean, much like in the Caribbean imaginary, the past is not just a pathway to the present, but in fact a present component. The future, similarly, is neither abstract nor dislocated. Rather, the past, present, and the future intertwine. They weave together to constantly produce new kinds of subjects and subjectivities, as Stuart Hall articulates. This compression of past, present, and future as an ontological tool, or mode of knowing, is a common theme in the fields of Caribbean studies, diaspora studies, Black digital humanities, and Black digital practice. In this project, as in the fields listed above, a quote, refusal of temporal fixity is enacted in order to put forth the potential of a material present and a speculative future. As Audre Lorde articulates, in this exhibition, space is demanded via an unclosed past for a now that can breed futures. So I don't know if you can really see here, but I just included a couple of steps. My next step, I'm still building out this different mapping feature and building out the exhibition in general. But like I said, I'm happy to share the QR code with anyone that wants access to it and has thoughts. This is an ongoing project. My next step is that I'm building in public-facing resources, so a class syllabi at different levels, also discussion questions and things, so this can be used as a tool in the classroom. And eventually I'll be creating a static version of the site. So ArcGIS is deeply dynamic, which is great. It allows all these sort of moving affordances, but also requires a lot of bandwidth. So when we really think through the question of open access for who and who has access to these things, static sites or minimal computing sites allow for websites to be loaded in spaces that don't have as high of bandwidth frequency, don't have access to high speed of internet or things like that, especially when thinking through Caribbean diasporic audiences. So those are all steps ongoing. Thank you all for joining me.